Hello, and welcome to our second lesson. So this lesson will be much closer, to the normal length because we're covering just one text. So uh, the ending of the lecture last time where we focused on the Iliad, that's mainly the length, the content. Those are similar here. Occasionally we'll focus on two texts, and so those lessons will be a little bit longer. But for this one, we're just focusing on the Odyssey because it's a very complex poem, and I assigned quite a bit of reading from it, so it's our sole focus for the second week of the course. The title, I should mention something about the title for this lesson, The Fall of Troy and Its Aftermath, Part 1. So as we mentioned before, the Trojan War is not a historical battle that actually took place. The events from Greek mythology that are known as the Trojan War, those events that were part of the Greek oral tradition, are loosely based on historical battles that did take place between the Greeks in parts of Asia Minor. So there is that, but the Trojan War is mainly an event invented by the bards who originally told the oral tales of ancient Greece that Homer eventually wrote down. But the reason I've titled this lecture, The Fall of Troy and Its Aftermath, is what we're studying in this lecture and what we'll study in the next one are two epic poems that both deal with the events that happened after the fall of Troy in Greek mythology. So this week, this lesson, we're focusing on the Odyssey, which is the other well-renowned epic poem by Homer, and it focuses on Odysseus' journey home after the Trojan War. And next time we'll look at the Aeneid, which is actually from Roman mythology, and is about how a Trojan, Aeneas, after the fall of Troy, traveled around the Mediterranean, eventually settled in Italy, and eventually founded the first Roman city. And it goes beyond just content or plot. Thematically, both of these texts, the Odyssey and the Aeneid next week, deal with the aftermath of war and what happens in the wake of war and the psychological experiences of that. And so this title is important in thematic ways too. As I mentioned before, uh, the Odyssey is about Odysseus' journey home following the Trojan War. So in the oral tradition of Greek mythology, the Trojan War lasted for 10 years, and Odysseus' journey home also took 10 years, so he was gone for a total of 20 years. As we transition here, I'll show you a quick image. This is the cover of an album by the heavy metal band Symphony X called The Odyssey, and it's a concept album that tells the story of the Odyssey. And this is just one of numerous examples of the Odyssey being retold, repurposed in popular culture. So the Odyssey has been around quite a long time, repurposed, reused by a wide variety of authors over time. Um, the movie O Brother, Where Art Thou by the Coen brothers is another example. And numerous poems, novels, stories, shows, movies have been either based on the Odyssey, loosely based on the Odyssey, or retold the Odyssey. So the Odyssey is an example of how Greek mythology is still very influential today, and part of the reason why we're studying it. So we'll definitely consider how ideas and themes from this text are reflected in our culture today. For recall, there's two things I'll ask you to look at here. Last time we read the Iliad, and so think about what some of the themes are from ancient Greek literature, and how would you characterize this culture? Again, this is a point where you may want to pause the lecture and try to answer these questions on your own as a way of critically thinking through the material to help you. But I would say things like pride, glory, honor, different types of love, not love as we think of it today, but familial love, hospitality, storytelling, any number of things, but certainly certain ones such as pride are at the forefront. Um, and then the other question here is, what are some unique features of the epic poem as a literary genre? Um, we looked at the Iliad as an epic poem, and as I mentioned last time, the epic was one of the very first literary genres. So there's a number of reasons for that. The epic often tells the story of a hero's journey, both physically and psychologically, and is about that hero's growth and development over that time. And if you think about this ancient world in the context we talked about before, of different cultures trading and interacting with each other, sharing stories and languages and ideas, if you were sharing your culture with another culture through storytelling, you'd probably want these larger-than-life heroes like Achilles and Odysseus. So those are some of the features of an epic poem. So keep in the back of your mind what we already know about Greek culture from the Iliad, and what else we might learn we haven't learned yet from the Odyssey, and then also the epic as a genre. How is the Odyssey similar to the Iliad, but also perhaps expands on or challenges this genre? So we have fewer historical factors to cover this time, which is helpful because we already know so much about the Greek culture and about how Homer composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. We're really just briefly covering a bit here about the Odyssey specifically. So be sure to keep in mind what we talked about last time with the Greek culture and the oral tradition, the use of written language for the first time, and creating an epic and preserving that oral tradition through the epic. But some things we haven't mentioned yet that have to do with the Odyssey are the title of the text. Or, excuse me, not the title, the first word. So, Andra, which is the Greek word for man, is the first word of the Odyssey. In both the Iliad and the Odyssey, the first word of the text is very important. The first word of the Iliad is rage, which I'm sure, as you know from our discussion of the Iliad and your reading of it, is very obvious. Couple of points here about man being the first word of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is a text that always operates on a twofold level. So Odysseus' journey as the epic hero is both physical, he's traveling home, and psychological. He goes through experiences that shape him and change him during this time. So one instance of it being twofold. The theme of man here, man being the first word of the poem, is also twofold. Odysseus is a man, so it's a story of a man, but it's also a story of mankind. In terms of it being a story of a man, we see Odysseus' journey from war to peace, which requires different skills from those needed on the battlefield, subsequently different from those possessed by Achilles. So this is a different type of story with a different type of hero, but by the same author drawing on a lot of the same cultural references. One key difference is that while Odysseus does have strength and physical courage and is a great athlete and warrior like Odysseus, he also is known more for his brains. He's often referred to as the cunning hero or the cleverest of those who fought at Troy. So he's very good with words, he's very intelligent, he's a strategist. In the oral tradition, he's one of the Greeks who helps design the Trojan horse. That eventually helps them win the war because he's a strategist. He also, in Book 9 of the Iliad, which we didn't read, I didn't assign for reading, but is in the textbook, he is the one that Agamemnon sends to try to convince Achilles to rejoin the war. Because he's so good with words, Agamemnon believes he can convince Achilles to return. So in the Odyssey, we see how these traits are tested and how they play out over the course of his journey home. And this is how, on one level, the text is about a single man, Odysseus. At the same time, the text is also about mankind, or humankind in a broader sense. The poem has a particular interest in the diversity of cultures and ways of life. We see different aspects of the Greek world. For instance, Sparta is a very rich place. We don't see Sparta in what we read for today, but in other parts of the poem, Odysseus travels to Sparta, and they're very wealthy there. That's where Helen, after the Trojan War, lives with her husband Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother. And Ithaca, where Odysseus is from is much poorer, much more rural, and so you see those differences in cultures. And he certainly interacts with a wide variety of cultures, including the Phaeacians. Um, so diversity, you could say, different ways of life, different cultures. Those are all themes of the poem. And in showing multiple encounters between the Greek hero and people who are very different from himself, the poem invites us to think about how we ought to behave toward people who are not the same as ourselves. So it engages our core theme of cosmopolitanism even more directly than the Iliad by asking, how should we conduct ourselves when we interact with other people who may be different from us? So in that sense, in addition to being about a man, Odysseus, the poem is also about mankind, or humankind. Like with the Iliad, I'm going to give you an outline of events, essentially a plot summary of the text, just to help you, because again, we're reading 3 books out of 24, only 1/8 of the text. Another important difference from the Iliad is that the events in the Odyssey are not told in chronological order. Again, this is about Odysseus' journey home. His son, Telemachus, is a grown man, and while he's away, his wife Penelope is being courted by a series of suitors. These suitors hope to marry her so that they can take Odysseus' place as king of Ithaca. And Telemachus is trying to keep order and keep charge of things while Odysseus is gone. He's been gone for nearly 20 years when the poem opens. So it's not out of the ordinary for people to be courting his wife. He's presumed dead and lost at sea after he doesn't return from the Trojan War right away. But they're being disrespectful when in her home. They're not being courteous guests. And so that's creating a problem, and Telemachus is trying to keep track of things. So the first 4 books of the Odyssey focus on what's going on at home in Ithaca with Telemachus and Penelope and the suitors. Books 5 through 6 do finally pick up with Odysseus' narrative, and they pick up very late in his narrative. Just like the Iliad opens near the end of the Trojan War, the Odyssey opens near the end of Odysseus' journey home, so almost exactly 10 years after the events of the Iliad take place. And at the time Telemachus is trying to manage things at home, Odysseus is trapped on an island with the nymph goddess Calypso. But he's already been traveling for almost 10 years, over 9 years at this point, and has had many adventures already. Calypso's island is the second to last stop he makes on his way home. She's kept him there for a long time, and finally the gods decide to allow him to leave. So he then travels to the island of the Phaeacians. And in books 7 and 8, those books recount his interactions with the Phaeacians. And those are the books I asked you to, 2 of the books I asked you to read for this lecture. His interactions with the Phaeacians are very important because they really reveal a lot about Odysseus himself, the way in which he interacts with these people. Achieves just that. So we learn more about Odysseus' character in books 7 and 8 when he interacts with the Phaeacians than in any other part of the text. Another reason why those interactions are very important is the Phaeacians possess the most advanced ships that can get Odysseus home. So he finally sees an opportunity to arrive home here. But he has to convince the Phaeacians to let him use their ships. And so these 2 books, again, you see a lot about his character because he has to act in a certain way to get their help. He has to be very courteous and be a good guest, be the opposite of the suitors who are in his home. And so you learn a lot about the interactions between cultures, and going back to the previous slide, what the text has to say about how one should interact with other cultures in this section. And finally, a third reason is that the way they agree to let him go and help him is by hearing his story. They ask him to tell his story. And so at the end of book 8, he starts telling his story. And books 9 through 12 involve him recounting his narrative to them. And this is important because this shows how important the oral tradition was. Homer could have really just told the story in chronological order like he does in the Iliad. But by telling it out of chronological order here and having Odysseus recount over the course of 4 books what happened, up to the point where the poem opens, we have an instance of the oral tradition. We have an instance of Odysseus telling a story. And this is another way in which Homer preserves the oral tradition. Not only does he preserve the events the oral tradition depicts, but he preserves the manner in which they were told by depicting Odysseus telling them here. And so that's very significant. And so after he starts telling the story in Book 8, Books 9 through 12 cover the events of his journey up to the point he arrived at Calypso's island. So the first 9 years, the majority of that time. And some of the events the poem is most famous for happened during this point. One of the first things that happens after he leaves Troy is they encounter the Cyclops Polyphemus, and he blinds. There's a whole island of Cyclopses. The one he interacts with is named Polyphemus. And Polyphemus is the sea god Poseidon's son, and Odysseus blinds him in order to help his men escape. But out of pride, he makes the mistake of announcing his name to the Cyclops when he had previously told the Cyclops that his name was unknown, or no man. And so now the Cyclops and Poseidon know who has blinded the Cyclops, and Poseidon takes out his wrath on Odysseus for blinding his son. And this is what makes much of Odysseus' journey home so difficult. So in books 10 through 12, we see some instances of Poseidon making his journey home difficult. In book 11, Odysseus visits the underworld, which is the other book I asked you to read for this lecture. That's probably the most famous of these three books that tell of his journey home, and he encounters many important figures such as Agamemnon and Achilles. And it also is the only instance in those 12 books where he pauses in his narrative and you have the Phaeacians interjecting. So seeing that pause where he's visiting the underworld and he's interacting with these different people, and the Phaeacians stop him and they say, "Hey, Odysseus, can you tell us something about the heroes you fought with in the Trojan War that you saw in the underworld, in the afterlife?" And he says, "Well, it's very late, but if you want me to continue the story, I will." And so that instance in Book 11 is another example that shows the importance of storytelling here in the oral tradition. In Book 12, recounts some of the last events. So in Charybdis, the slaughter of Helios's cattle, which is an example of Odysseus' men disobeying him and not being good, courteous guests. And so after Helios is the sun god. So after they slaughter Helios's cattle, Zeus kills everyone but Odysseus. The gods have foreordained that Odysseus will make it home. So it is Odysseus' fate to make it home, and Helios and Poseidon want Zeus to kill not just Odysseus' entire crew, but Odysseus himself. And Zeus refuses to kill Odysseus because even the gods must follow prophecy and fate. And it has been prophesied that Odysseus will make it home. So when Odysseus arrives on Calypso's island, he's by himself. And that brings us up to where the text starts. And thus he concludes his storytelling to the Phaeacians. And so the Phaeacians decide to send him home. And in Book 13, he arrives at home. And the second half of the Odyssey is devoted to him reclaiming his kingdom. He's first in disguise. His wife eventually comes to the conclusion that she needs to remarry, so she hosts a competition of archery, and whoever's the best archer will get to marry her, and archery is one of the skills Odysseus already possessed. So in disguise, he wins the archery competition, and before marrying Penelope, he reveals that he's actually her husband, Odysseus, but after he's won the challenge fair and square. And then because the suitors were discourteous guests, Odysseus slays them with the help of the gods, and before he fully reclaims his kingdom, the families of the suitors try to take revenge, but again, Odysseus fends them off with the help of the gods, and he eventually, at the end in Book 24, reclaims his throne and is once again king of Ithaca, home with his wife and son. So here are the reading questions that I posted for you. What important similarities and differences do you see between Odysseus and Achilles? Again, I would pause the lecture here and try to answer these on your own. One important difference is that Odysseus is a thinker. We mentioned this before. He's a strategist. He uses his mind and his words He knows how to say the right things at the right time, thinks things through, and approach them tactically from a very strategic standpoint. Whereas Achilles just relies on his strength and force, his wrath, his rage. Achilles is half god. His mother is a goddess and his father is a god, and he's been dipped in the river Styx, making him all but his heel godlike. So that's a significant difference. Odysseus is part god, but much less so. Somewhere way back in his lineage, one of his grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, somewhere way back there, one of them was a god or goddess, and so he has some god blood running through him, but he's much less than half god or even a quarter god. A similar comparison would be Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, how he has some noble elf blood way back there, and that makes him a Numenorian rather than just a man, but he's much closer to a man than, say, Achilles. So we learned some things about Greek culture, especially about pride, last time. So you might pause the lecture here and try to think about the things you learned about Greek culture in the last lesson and what new things you've learned. But we'll revisit these as we look at the next slide. So here we move on to the content of the text. Again, you might want to pause this and try to answer these on your own before I go through them. With the first one, Odysseus is a cunning hero. We just talked about this, but it helps to elaborate on it here. So Odysseus is very intelligent. He's a strategist. He's good with words. And the word cunning is used to describe him. He uses deception quite a bit. The Trojan horse is an example of deception, and he helps invent that. And so deception and being cunning are looked at. The words aren't used quite the same way in this culture as they're used in our own. And they're used in a very positive way here. These are positive skills that he has. His ability to deceive people, to think things through, to be an effective strategist. These are very positive things for the ancient Greeks. Some examples of this we see with the Phaeacians. If we flip over passages for closer reading, you could look at book 7, lines 220 to 240. And if you look there, you'll see that the text says that Odysseus says all of the right things at all of the right times. And he really does this with the Phaeacians. He shows just enough about himself that the Phaeacians are willing to send him back. One great example is with the Princess Nausicaa. Because he's traveled through the water, when Odysseus arrives there, he's naked, but he clothes himself and is respectful around the princess, and then the princess leads him to the castle. And her father, Alcinous, he asks why he didn't come here with the princess, and Odysseus basically says he didn't want anything to look improprietous. So he's very courteous. He's a great guest. Hospitality is an important theme for the Greeks, and so the Phaeacians are great hosts, and Odysseus is a great guest, and he needs their help to get home. So by being a great guest, that's an example of him being a cunning hero. And I must apologize here because I wanted to go forward and show you these passages and then go back to the questions, because the questions tie into these passages. But because I'm recording, PowerPoint won't let me go back and look at the other slide. I didn't realize that would happen. So you'll have to forgive me for that, but I'll try to cover some of these things that are important here rather quickly for you. And in the future, I'll keep that in mind. And so what I would recommend for future lessons is to, after I go over the questions, to maybe pause the lecture and look up those passages. Or when you're working on your discussion board questions, or if this is a text you want to write on, to revisit the part of the lecture that lists out the passages. To pause it there. I'll also try to post the PowerPoints without audio, since I have both versions, so that you can just flip through the slides quickly to reference certain things. But anyway, here, my second question had to do with what Odysseus' interactions with the Phaeacians reveal about himself, and they reveal some pretty important things. He's prideful just like Achilles, but he only shows it at the right time. So he doesn't boast until he's challenged. And in Book 8, which is the second quote I have here, Book 8, lines 180 to 204, one of the Phaeacians, Laodamas, challenges Odysseus. I think he's kind of jealous of Odysseus here, and he says, "You're greedy," which is a huge insult in ancient Greek culture, and you're not a good athlete. And Odysseus basically calls him a fool, then picks up a discus and throws it really far. And he says, I'll stand up to anyone who challenges me except the king. So he's still being a good guest here. He's standing up for his pride and defending his honor, but saying he won't stand up to the king. So he's being respectful of the king while at the same time still boasting just enough. So he engages with the Greek value of pride that we saw so prominently in the Iliad, but does so while still being a courteous guest. So it's very balanced. This next passage from Book 11 is the part I talked about earlier, where Odysseus pauses in his storytelling when the Phaeacians ask him, as he's seeing the spirits from the underworld, and they ask him to talk about the spirits of the Greek warriors. And so the importance of that passage is that it reflects the importance of storytelling and oral tradition. The last passage here from Book 11 is when Odysseus is talking with Agamemnon in the underworld, and Agamemnon talks about how his wife killed him. There's a lot of reasons for this. He cheated on her. He also killed one of their daughters, Clytemnestra, as a sacrifice to the gods, because the gods asked him to in order to bless his voyage to Troy. So she takes vengeance in a way in the 21st century we would understand very clearly. We would sympathize with Agamemnon's wife. But Agamemnon himself does act within the confines of the code of the Greek culture. And so he's complaining about his wife here. He says, "As I lay dying," is the start of his speech, and it's a very famous speech that's been quoted in other literary texts. But he basically compares his wife to Odysseus' wife, Penelope, who's very good and virtuous. And so this shows partly why Odysseus wants to make it home, but also the Greek view of femininity, which is a very negative view from a 21st century perspective. And we should not impose our 21st century perspective on the text, but at the same time, we can see why Agamemnon's wife would take the action she did. And so Greek culture doesn't allow much autonomy or independence for females, as we saw last time in the Iliad, with the taking of women as prizes after battle. And along the same lines, even though Penelope, Odysseus' wife, is depicted in a positive way, she is only kind of allowed that role. She does absolutely nothing wrong. So it's a very all black and white, no shades of gray, either completely good or automatically bad. And so it's a kind of negative view of femininity that comes through in Agamemnon's speech, and it reflects the patriarchal culture. So this is a theme we'll talk about throughout the course. We'll see over time, as we look at different cultures and Western civilization continues to develop, or are women treated better or not than they are here. And that was the last really significant passage I wanted to look at in relation to the questions that were on the previous slide. So finally, here we have the pedagogical or learning questions that I've asked you to answer on Canvas. So I'm only going to look at these briefly because I'd like you to answer them on there. We talked about hospitality already and how that's important. One of the reasons it was important is that if a god could show up at your house disguised, so you had to be a courteous host. But you also were expected to be a courteous guest in this culture, and Odysseus does that well because he himself is a king and he knows what to expect from a guest. And the suitors are not good guests in his home, and that's why they must be slayed later on. We just talked about gender roles. The Phaeacians question is an important one. I'm not going to dwell on it too much here. And these last two questions have to do with cosmopolitanism and the epic. So think through both of those things. Those are kind of the two themes we started with on the recall. So please revisit those. Well, you can answer any of these questions, but those are two very important ones. So please think them through thoroughly if you decide to answer them on Canvas. We see Odysseus interact with a number of different cultures here, and especially connected to the first question about hospitality. What does the Greek culture say about interacting with other cultures in relation to cosmopolitanism? And finally, how does this expand on the epic as a genre? Both the Iliad and the Odyssey showed the physical and psychological journeys of Achilles and Odysseus, but I would say the Odyssey goes much more into the psychology of Odysseus, and he's a more complex figure psychologically than Achilles. So that's a good starting point, but I'd love to hear from you what you think of his mind and how he develops as a character, what you think of his psychology. And again, the last slide, the final slide here, just brings us back to those two central questions of what is unique and specific to this text, as well as what transcends it and is universal. So there are certain things we would probably only see in a Greek text, like the depiction of pride here, but at the same time, we also certainly see how Odysseus' desire to get home is something we can all relate to. So also continue to think about these questions. Always be thinking about these questions with any text we read.